Hello and welcome to Lecture 7. This is going to be part 2 of the Gender and War in India's Northeast series, and this will be part 2 of 3. So, India's Northeast, and there is not anything in the book about LGBTQ or transgender, but hey, they're there. And so I just thought I'd show you in a slide here, the introductory slide. But India's Northeast really does not make a whole lot of sense. Before I started studying India for this book, I just really didn't think too much about the Northeast. But if you look at the map of India, you will see that there's this blob that looks like it's some sort of strange polyp hanging off of India, right? It looks like it's really something that should be off there in Southeast Asia. So there is a very narrow corridor, the Siliguri corridor, which is also known as the Chicken's Neck, which is basically the little stem of this polyp that separates not only the country of Bangladesh from Nepal, but it also separates the rest of India from the Northeast, from the 7 sister states outlined here that make up the Northeast. So I live over near the Oxmoor Road exit in West Homewood, and many people have described that intersection of Oxmoor, West Oxmoor, and a variety of other streets over near me as designed by somebody on LSD, right? I think that this probably could apply here as well, right? It does not really make a whole lot of sense. But there it is. So much like the area of Chhattisgarh, this is a relatively heavily forested area. It had been pretty underdeveloped, fairly neglected during the British colonial era. And so now lots of industries, both Indian and outside, would love to get their hands on that nice fertile land, and especially oil and minerals underneath that land, right? So the last decade or so, the Modi government, well, last few years, the Modi government has been pouring money into the Northeast in an effort to try to end the ongoing warfare, right? So the assumption is that the warfare's root cause is poverty and unemployment, and if you put a lot of money into the region, poverty and unemployment will go away. But we'll see that there's really an ethnic dimension to a lot of these conflicts. So Sikkim is considered part of the Northeast. It is not one of the original 7 sisters. It is located on the opposite side of the Chicken's Neck from the 7 sisters. Assam is one of the 7 sisters. It doesn't touch any of the 7 sisters. So basically in this lecture, I'm not paying any attention to Sikkim. With the exception of Sikkim, all of the 7 sisters of Northeast India, well, I had already said Sikkim wasn't one of the 7 sisters, but with the all of the states of Northeast India have had at least one militant movement, and some of them have had even more. So there are many, many, many different reasons why people, primarily indigenous people, have taken up arms in the Northeast. But the most common scenario is that an ethnic linguistic group feels that it's losing its culture. Now, the book doesn't go through all the 7 sisters. It only goes through some of the major conflicts, and so I'm just going to stick to those ones in my discussion here. So in terms of the demography of Northeast India, right, so this is going to be all those 7 states together. There are at least 70 different indigenous groups, right? And remember, in India, they call them tribals. Several hundred languages, and Hinduism and Islam are the predominant languages, but as we'll see, there's a significant Christian minority, plus a smattering of other. So the states range from being about a fifth tribal to being 90% tribal. It just depends on the state. But nearly 28% of India's tribals live in the Northeast, and the tribals are mostly Christian. Now, my assumption was that, missionaries of yore had converted their ancestors, but actually, apparently most of the conversion took place after independence. So, in the Northeast, the tribals do not usually self-identify as Adivasi. Remember, Adivasi is what they're called in Chhattisgarh, but here the tribals are predominantly of Mongoloid heritage, right? So just looking at them at first glance, you might think that they're Southeast Asian or maybe even Chinese, right? And they tend to reserve the term Adivasi for the Tea tribes in the Northeast. Now, the Tea tribes are the descendants of the millions of tribal migrants from West Bengal and from parts of Andhra Pradesh, who during colonial era were marched up, sometimes forcibly, up to colonial Assam, where they had to work on the tea plantations in a variety of exploitative schemes. So their descendants still live there and still work and are still exploited on these plantations. These tea tribes resent the fact that the state of Assam characterizes them not as scheduled tribes, which would give them lots of legal benefits, but rather as other backward castes. So in terms of women in war, again, it varies by the state and the indigenous group, but for the most part, women in this region have played varying roles. Sometimes they have been militants, right? And you can see this picture here, one of many, many instances in which the women in Manipur protested British rule when their men were too scared to do so. But in some cases, women have been the victims of war. Very frequently, we'll see that women were the abettors of war, right? So they may have been helping out the militant movements, even if they didn't necessarily take up arms themselves. So women in this area are no shrinking violets, but several decades of armed conflict have hampered women's mobility and thus women's access to education, employment, healthcare, etc. So in all of the Seven Sisters, there have been counterinsurgency operations by the state against the various militant groups. And to varying degrees, these state counterinsurgency operations have involved sexual violence, most of which has been perpetrated by the men employed by the state. So in 1972, AFSPA was applied to much of the Northeast. And remember, AFSPA was actually created earlier. You can see that these women in Manipur are protesting AFSPA being created in 1958, right? So it was applied to a number of parts of India, including Kashmir. And this is that emergency legislation that basically gives police and soldiers carte blanche to arrest people without warrants, to search and detain, etc., etc. So back in 1972, when it was first applied, there were a few rebel groups operating in the area, but by 2017, there were at least 60 different rebel groups operating, most of them in Manipur. So this legislation was in effect for a very long time, and only within the last few years has it been lifted in some parts of the Northeast, such as Manipur. However, it is still in force in Assam, Nagaland, and parts of Arunachal Pradesh, which is not the latter is not discussed in the book I assigned. So I could not get a hard, fast figure as to how many people had died in the Northeast as a result of all of these insurgencies. The closest thing I could come up with, the most recent thing I could come up with was 2017, an estimated 500,000 dead. And here is one unfortunate woman who she may have been somebody who helped out the rebels. She may not have been. She may have just been in the wrong place at the wrong time. But in any case, you can read here what happened to her, and it was pretty clear to the people who found her that she'd been raped, because the way she was killed was something like 30 gunshot wounds to the genital region, right? So basically trying to cover up any evidence of rape. So the women over in the right in Manipur are the mothers of Manipur, and they're all on the older side. I think the youngest one was in her 40s. So they even though they were on a basically a military state of emergency and they couldn't gather, somebody dropped a handkerchief or some sort of signal, and then all the mothers threw off their clothes, got stark naked, and whipped out these banners. Indian Army rape us, meaning instead of our daughters, right? Indian Army take our flesh was another one. So they went out in front of the military barracks to protest Manorama's death. And they got arrested for it, of course. Okay, so the first state that we'll look at here is Nagaland. And in 1946, as independence grew near, the Naga National Council, or the NNC, asked for national self-determination. So the Naga typically lived in the Naga Hills. Where are the Naga Hills? Naga Hills, right in here. And they're culturally, linguistically, etc. unique. They wanted to do their own thing. However, the new map of independent India included the Naga Hill region in the state of Assam. And at partition, the NNC declared that Nagaland would be independent, right? So basically, they declared that they were going to secede from independent India. A referendum that was held by the NNC found that 99.9% of the voters surveyed agreed with declaring independence. However, this was not to be. So Nagaland got absorbed into Assam, and I will go through resistance to that in a minute, but basically it split off from Assam eventually in 1963 and formally became a state. But there is still a movement for a greater Nagaland. Right, so the border with Assam has remained disputed, I should add. And so the Naga people are spread out not only among a number of different Indian states, but among a number of different states in general, right? You can even find them in Sri Lanka, but there are a lot of them living in Myanmar as well. So they want to have a greater Nagaland with all the contiguous tribes living together, presumably in their own state. So the Naga are a diaspora people, right? They're spread out over a variety of different countries. And in Nagaland, in addition to the Naga, you also have what are referred to as illegal immigrants. I've put it in quotation marks here because some of these illegal immigrants are the descendants of those who immigrated to the region a century ago, maybe half a century ago. But they're not ethnically Naga. So recently they've gotten disenfranchised within the last couple of years. And in Naga, in order to try to protect the indigenous people, I mean, in some ways, I guess it's like a Native American reservation, right? You can't just wander in there. You have to get permission to go there. And if you're not Naga, you can't own land there, right? So for a while, they were having provisions for non-Naga natives, basically, like the people who've been there for generations and been born there, etc. But now they've removed those, and they're calling them illegal immigrants. So most of the Naga are Christian. Who is a Naga? The term is of disputed origin. It's basically what the British called the people they found in the area, and there's not a single definition of a Naga. It's basically an umbrella category. So there are more than 100 Naga sub-tribes in different states of India's northeast and in Burma. According to She Goes to War, there are 17 different Naga groups in Nagaland proper. And apparently there are some groups that basically Nagas sort of whisper, well, they're really not Naga, but they say they're Naga, so we'll pretend, basically. So it's conflicting, right? So in terms of women in war, in 1951, all right, so this is after the Naga got absorbed into India in the state of Assam, even though they didn't want to be there. Some of them just tried to hash out whether they should try to create a compromise with India that would permit them some autonomy, some sort of like federalism. But they set up their own parallel government, including a militia, and this did not go over well with the center, as they call the federal government in India. So India sent in troops, and soon thereafter it took on emergency powers. So by February of 1956, India established a military occupation in what is now Nagaland. And military occupation, of course, involved burning of villages, torture, rape, a variety of other atrocities. And of course, the reaction was to fuel the Naga insurrection even more. Right? So after 1963, right, when they became their own state, there were still many combing operations, and this is a term, apparently it's a literal translation of an Urdu term, and it means that the police go from house to house or hut to hut looking for rebels. So there were many Naga separatist groups formed, some of which were rivals, and during the counterinsurgency, when the center forces would go from house to house, surprise, surprise, there was a lot of sexual violence against women, a lot of torture, and the sexual violence was especially brutal. Girls in their young teens might die from the injuries or often would commit suicide thereafter. So women militants do exist. And when I saw this photograph, I must admit there were words that I would not want recorded that escaped my mouth. And I said, surely this is a joke. It's not. Right? This is the son of a prominent Naga rebel and his blushing bride here. And this is actually a photograph of, I think they called it a Guns N' Roses wedding. Okay, so the Naga nationalists continue to fight, but they're not just fighting the Indian state. Very often they're fighting other ethnic groups, such as the Kukis, and there were several years of conflict between the Naga and the Kukis, and some 1,000 Kukis were killed during this time. So that's why they hold basically a day of memory every year. And the Naga insurgents themselves are said to perpetrate sexual violence. Right? And here's one example. Usually in Nagaland, the woman is threatened with a weapon by an attacker, and there's no point in her reporting the sexual assault to the police because what are they going to do? They don't have domain over the insurgents. So in theory, if the commanders of the Naga rebels learned about it, in theory they could give the death penalty to their guerrillas who rape, but in practice we don't know that they really do, and the public does not know the outcome of rebels' internal disciplinary hearings. Okay, Assam. And you know what? I think I will stop it here for the sake of trying to upload a video in less than 8 hours. I'll stop it here and I'll pick up with part 3 here.